China. China. China was the third most or fifth most powerful country when I was growing up. It is now the second most or first most powerful country in the world today. So let's talk about how the People's Republic of China comes about. The Long March was the result of Stalin's alliance with the Chinese Communist Party's enemies, the Kuomintang. Kuomintang, the Chinese National Party under Chiang Kai-shek, was semi-socialist, semi-fascist, and Stalin thought he could do a deal with him and that they could win the Chinese Civil War for Stalin. Well, Chiang Kai-shek's experiment was stymied by the Japanese, who constantly invaded China. So, after World War, to survive during this period of Soviet patronage of their enemies, Chinese communists disobey Stalin. And under Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, they go on a long march through the countryside and hinterland of China, just trying to survive, until they finally get to Yan'an, which is an area near the Mongolian border at that time, where they can be somewhat supported by Soviets who don't really want the communists completely destroyed, they just want them out of the main picture. The Chinese Communist Party is defined by the Long March. When they call it a long march, they ain't just a woofing. It's something that takes years, and basically, it winnows down people. Only the strong survive the Long March. Only the truly ideologically committed survive the Long March. Mao Zedong saved them all on the Long March. So each of these survivors owe Mao a personal debt of gratitude. They owe him their lives. And they are going to be his cadre of revolutionists who are going to change China radically. But it is built in this crucible, this ordeal that is the Long March. After World War II, Stalin changes his preference. The nationalists are being supported too much by the Americans, so the Chinese communists are going to be supported by the Russians. And remember, in the last weeks of the war, the Russians invade Japanese Manchuria, and Russian troops begin directly supporting Mao Zedong's Chinese. We do not support the nationalists nearly the same degree. And frankly, the nationalists are corrupt and inefficient and bad fighters. This is unfortunate, but it is true. The Maoists, the communists, are not any of those things. They are stronger because of the experience of the Long March, and they are getting direct aid from the Soviets, and so they are very effective fighters. And by 1949, Mao drives Chiang to the island of Taiwan. The mainland Chinese landmass is now the People's Republic of China. China invades Tibet in 1950 and turns the Dalai Lama into a puppet until he finally escapes. And since 1950 has been trying to repopulate Tibet with Han Chinese that are loyal to the regime. They're doing the same thing in Xinjiang. We'll get to the Uyghurs later. The Chinese also fight the Americans in Korea in 1950, and with Soviet help, the Red Chinese help prevent an American and United Nations victory in Korea. Instead, they actually demonstrate that they are very good fighters even against Americans. Ask the Marines who survived the Chosin Reservoir retreat about the Chinese and their abilities. But by the mid-1950s, Mao Zedong is unhappy because China is not as communist as it should be. So in, I think, 1957, Mao promulgates the Great Leap Forward, which is China's forced collectivization of agriculture, just like Stalin did in the Ukraine in 1929-30. But it's more restrictive. It is more micromanaging. The Great Leap Forward causes China to starve, and tens of millions of Chinese starve to death. And anyone who resists is a traitor and is killed, or brainwashed and then killed, or brainwashed and then sent back. To be an example, other communist leaders go to Mao in the early 60s and say, Too many Chinese are dying. We are destroying our own country. We are destroying our own people. Mao's answer is Chinese. There's always more of them. There's always more where they came from. Killing a few tens of millions might make things better. The other communist leaders forced Mao to stop. Oh, he didn't like that. Mao did not like being forced to stop. He accepted. He seemed to play along. He, after all, was only first among equals. But he's still first among equals after they forced him to stop the Great Leap Forward. Less than 2 years later, Mao's at it again. He declares the Cultural Revolution, which from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s wages war against the four olds, old traditions, old economies, old power, anything that's old. The Chinese written language is destroyed, replaced by a simplified Newspeak version of written Chinese, which the People's Republic still uses today in its pinyin translations. Real Chinese is only written in Taiwan and in the diaspora of Chinese around the world. They go after the Chinese family. They have children inform on their parents. Every town square is filled with meetings run by 13-year-olds with Kalashnikov assault rifles and little red books of sayings of Mao. And anyone who was strong and powerful in the old society, like school teachers, within limits, is publicly ridiculed. They're put in stocks. The dunce cap is put on top of them with their crimes written on it, and they are beaten and ridicule is heaped upon them. And you've got to do it to the people that were in your world. Everyone has to betray someone. During the Cultural Revolution, my brother's friends, my brother's wife's family, my best friend, who's like a brother's wife's family, her father, my friend's wife's father, had one of his many jobs. His father was semi-senile, and so he used to write the truths of his life in traditional calligraphy poetry on the papered walls of the little room that he had. But every week, the block mother would come and inspect. And if those poems or calligraphy or the supplies were found, the family would be out on the street and would be sent to re-education camps. So my best friend's father-in-law had to take those papers every week, hide the calligraphy gear, muzzle his old man, and burn everything in order to prevent the block mother, who was the spy in the neighborhood, from ratting him out. Even then, he had to worry if members of his own family would rat him out too, because the pressure was on. Everyone informed on everyone. When you give 14-year-olds a little book of truth and guns and the power of life and death, Lord of the Flies seems like a happy Disney tale of bunnies, muffins, and rainbow unicorns. Between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, it makes Mao Zedong by far the greatest mass murderer in all of human history. Hitler at worst killed 20 million people or so, and that includes some wartime deaths. Well, it includes deaths his regime inflicted on people he was in charge of, between 18 and 20 million people. And that was for a dozen years. Stalin made Hitler look like an amateur. Stalin kills between 30 and 60 million Russians over a reign that lasts from the late 1920s, about 25 years until the early 1950s. So Stalin reigns for twice as long as Hitler and kills 30 to 60 million rather than 15 to 20 million. But Mao is in charge of China. Well, he's in charge of the communist regions of China from the mid-1920s, but he's in charge of all of China from 1949 up through his death in 1975, 59, 69. So again, about 26 years. Mao kills between 80 and 120 million Chinese in peacetime. 80 to 120 million people. That's larger than the population of the British Isles. That's larger than Germany. 80 to 120 million people in 25 years, not by natural causes, Not by war. Nope. By the murderous policies of the Chinese Communist Party, which destroys every family, every institution, and every memory in the People's Republic of China. It is by far the worst purge and oppression so far in human history in terms of duration and scale. Late in this period, as the Soviets seem to be the Sparta in our modern Peloponnesian War, if you remember that image, as the Soviets seem to be winning the Cold War, President Nixon decides he's going to compensate for Russian power by making nice with the Chinese. Nixon goes to China. In Beijing, he meets with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, and normalization is established, normal relations, and it's gonna lead towards us tilting away from Taiwan towards Beijing, away from the nationalist Chinese towards the communist Chinese. But we make clear we're not going to allow China to take over Taiwan. We have a defense agreement with Taiwan, and if the Chinese come across against Taiwan, we're going to fight them. That is law, that is policy, and the Chinese are told this in no uncertain terms. But when Mao dies, his murderous policies in the Cultural Revolution are perpetuated by his wife and a few other close aides, which are known as the Gang of Four, but they are overthrown by Deng Xiaoping in the mid to late 1970s. China is now a wasteland of tortured, traumatized people. People who have lived through something like the Holocaust, something akin to the Holocaust, but where everyone in China was a Jew, because everyone in China is a potential traitor. Everyone knew people who died. Everyone was personally victimized or a victimizer. No one was spared. And everyone who survived the Cultural Revolution bears its scars. Except for a small cadre of party elite who were raised in isolation, which includes the current president of China, Xi Jinping, who is so sheltered from all of this. The experience that he has in life is limited. We'll talk about post-Cultural Revolution China next time.